The quality of a firm's workforce planning decisions directly affects the performance of a manager's staff. Let's take a look at the importance of workforce planning. If, as a manager, you do not have the right number of employees with the right skill sets, you'll find your unit unable to take advantage of potential business opportunities. On the flip side, a surplus of employees translates into a bloated payroll level, benefits, and other employee-related expenses. If your staff members operate short-handed for any length of time or lack the skills they need, they're likely to feel overworked and experience burnout. Remember that job design does the following. It focuses on decisions about how jobs should be structured, ensures that job-related skills and activities are performed in a way that has the most potential to add value to the company and its customers. The best designed jobs in the world add no value if people are not in a position to perform them, however. Workforce planning is the process of making sure that individuals with the right skills are where they need to be at the right time to meet an organization's current and future needs. In many ways, workforce planning is an ongoing balancing act. Companies must balance the demand for labor with the available supply of labor. A firm's labor demand refers to the numbers and types of employees the company needs to meet its current and future strategic objectives. The labor supply refers to the availability of current or potential employees to perform a company's jobs. In other words, managers have to take a look at both the labor supply and the labor demand within their company's internal considerations, and they also need to anticipate a plan for factors outside their company's external considerations. Understanding the supply and demand for labor is only half the equation. Managers must also take action to address labor shortages and surpluses. A labor shortage exists when the demand for labor exceeds the available supply of it. In contrast, a labor surplus exists when the supply of labor is greater than the demand for it. At any point in time, some parts of a company may be facing shortages of employee talent, whereas others may have surpluses. Let's now discuss these internal factors in more detail. Managers consider the internal labor force or a company's current employees when it comes to meeting current and long-term workforce needs. However, the internal labor force is not static, but changes over time. Employee turnover, which directly affects a firm's labor demand, includes the voluntary and involuntary termination of employees within an organization. The primary difference between the two types is whether the turnover is initiated by the company, which is involuntary turnover, or by the employee, which is voluntary turnover. Industries vary in their total rate of separation, voluntary and involuntary turnover, as well as their voluntary turnovers. Service industries, such as accommodation, food and drinking places, the arts, entertainment, and recreation, as well as retail and wholesale, tend to have higher turnover rates than do high-tech, education, government, and professional trade organizations. Turnover has significant impact on organizations. The most obvious impact occurs when a company loses a talented employee. Another problem occurs when an employee's former coworkers, those who remain at the firm, must pick up the slack to make sure the work still gets done. Even when a replacement employee is eventually hired, his or her coworkers are still likely to experience stress until the newly hired person gets fully up to speed. Even without turnover, the profile of a company's workforce changes over time as employees move into different jobs. Companies use promotions, transfers, and demotions to move employees from one job to another. Promotions involve moving employees to higher level positions, which often are associated with increased levels of responsibility and authority. Employees can also transfer to other jobs with similar levels of responsibility. Employees can also be demoted or moved to lower level positions within their company. Of course, moving people throughout an organization should not be done haphazardly. Managers can use several tools to help track employee movements: replacement charts, succession planning, and transition matrices. Companies use replacement charts to identify potential replacement employees for positions that could open up within their organization. Essentially, a replacement chart shows the employees who could possibly be moved from one job to another if vacancies occur. With such a system in place, a company is ready to make personnel changes on short notice. Succession planning is similar to using replacement charts but focuses on identifying employees who might be viable successors for top managerial positions. As the name implies, succession planning involves identifying who is next in line for higher level jobs. It also requires the company to fill in information about any skill a potential successor needs to develop. A well-defined succession process is important for a variety of reasons. A third tool that managers can use to understand the internal movement trends of their workforces is a transition matrix. A transition matrix provides a model for tracking the movement of employees throughout an organization rather than in a single job over a certain period of time. Productivity refers to the level of a firm's output, the products or services, relative to inputs, employees, equipment, material, and so forth, used to produce the output. A productivity ratio reflects the number of employees, labor demand, needed to achieve a certain output level of sales, production, and so forth. You can figure out these ratios by collecting data of your firm's output levels versus the number of employees in prior years. Sales data and the amount of products produced in previous years are examples of the type of output data firms use to calculate their productivity ratios. One of the benefits of understanding the productivity ratio is that it allows you to plan for different potential scenarios that reflect the growth or decline in the demand of your products. Of course, companies can intervene in ways that directly impact their productivity ratios. To some extent, managers can control internal labor factors. Managers also have to evaluate factors in the external environment over which they have less control. These factors relate to local labor market, economic conditions, and industry trends that impact the supply and demand for goods and services. The local labor market. People in the local labor market represent a potential external labor supply for firms. One of the major drivers of the size and composition of the local labor market available to a firm is its location. Local labor markets vary dramatically in terms of the number and types of individuals within them available to work. Economic considerations. The general health of the economy, particularly the unemployment rate, has a big impact on the availability of workers. As the unemployment rate rises, firms find it easier to hire qualified individuals in the external labor market. In contrast, when the unemployment rate drops, hiring qualified individuals becomes more difficult. Industry trends. Many industries experience predictable purchasing patterns that fluctuate over time and directly influence when they experience labor shortages or surpluses. Although an economy's leading indicators, such as the employment rate and inflation rate, are fairly predictable, sometimes labor demand patterns are subject to industry shocks. Shocks are dramatic changes in the nature of products or services offered in the economy or dramatic changes in how companies compete. When faced with a labor shortage, most people initially think about recruiting new employees. Some of the typical methods are using overtime and contingent labor, increasing employee retention rates, strategically using employee promotions, transfers, and demotions, and hiring new employees. One of the quickest ways to handle a labor shortage is through the use of overtime. Overtime refers to employees working additional hours beyond their standard schedule. Most full-time employees work a 40-hour work week. To address a labor shortage, managers may require that their employees work additional hours to meet company needs. Retailers often ask current employees to work extra hours around the holidays, as an example. In addition to overtime, a second tactic you can use to remedy a labor shortage is to arrange for external or outsourced workers to produce your goods or services. Outsourcing is the practice of sending work to other companies. Companies often outsource activities such as the maintenance of their grounds, food service for their cafeterias or vending machines, and payroll management. In addition to outsourcing, companies also hire contingent labor to remedy labor shortages. Contingent labor refers to employees hired on a temporary or contractual basis as opposed to a permanent basis. Estimates for the number of temporary workers in the workforce vary, but all estimates point to a continued rise in the number of the workforce. Contingent labor also provides company both numerical and functional flexibility. Numerical flexibility refers to the number of employees working for the company. Using contingent workers gives company the flexibility to adjust their number of employees relatively quickly. This can be a major benefit for companies that face predictable variations in the demand for their services. Functional flexibility refers to the types of skills employees possess. Because companies can readily adjust the contingent workers they use, they can quickly modify the composition of the knowledge, skills, and abilities of their workforces. As a result, companies don't have to make long-term investments to develop or hire workers for particular skills that are needed only for a short period of time. Turnover is a significant cause of labor shortages. Knowing that you will be able to retain a steady number of your employees will also improve your workforce forecasting, at least at the internal side of the equation. Employee satisfaction is a key predictor of turnover, and in the remaining portions of this course, we'll look at how to improve it. Rather than rely on your current employees to work longer hours, as a manager, you might opt to move employees from one area of the company to another area that has a labor shortage. This can be an effective way to deal with a labor shortage, especially because it can be done quickly. Because companies are already familiar with current employees, managers are also likely to be better informed about the potential these employees have to succeed in their new jobs. The final tactic for addressing a labor shortage is to recruit and hire a new full-time employee. While overtime and employee transitions focus on addressing labor shortages with current employees, hiring new employees increases the size of your workforce. One of the primary benefits of full-time new hires is that this approach provides a more permanent solution to a labor shortage instead of a temporary one. There's no single best solution for how to deal with a labor shortage or surplus. Each of the tactics discussed here has advantages and disadvantages that must be considered, such as how long you expect a shortage or surplus to last. As we've indicated, using overtime and contingent labor can remedy a shortage very quickly. In contrast, improving employee retention to remedy a shortage takes more time to accomplish, as does hiring new employees and getting them up to speed. Employing surplus labor is likely to be financially prohibitive for many organizations, particularly when the surpluses are anticipated to be permanent or last for a long time. Layoffs, attrition, hiring freezes, early retirement programs, and movement of employees either temporarily or permanently to other work areas are some of the common tactics managers use to address labor surpluses. A layoff involves quickly reducing the number of workers you employ. The primary advantage of layoffs is that a company can use them to relatively quickly adjust the size and composition of its workforce. When carried out effectively, a layoff can be an isolated event that results in a good balance between an organization's needs and the capabilities of its employees. However, layoffs are associated with several disadvantages. Companies sometimes focus solely on short-term cost containment efforts when making layoff decisions rather than long-term objectives. Two tactics that companies may turn to when coping with a labor surplus primarily focus on delaying the hiring of new employees. Attrition refers to the decision to not fill vacant positions that emerge as a result of turnover or other employee movements with the organization. Hiring freezes put a temporary ban on the hiring of new employees for a specified period of time. One of the advantages of using attrition and hiring freezes is to right-size the workforce, in that it creates lower levels of stress among employees than layoffs do. Early retirement programs are an additional tactic companies turn to in order to address their labor surpluses. The goal of these programs is to provide employees with a financial incentive to retire early, thereby lowering the number of a firm's employees and their overall labor costs. A final tactic for addressing labor surpluses is to use employee promotions, transfers, and demotions. Just as these practices can remedy a labor shortage, they can also remedy labor surpluses. Employees in the surplus labor areas might not have the needed skills to succeed in new jobs. First, it affects how quickly the company is likely to need to respond to labor shortages or surpluses. Second, it affects how critical different skill sets are in the organization, which in turn determines the workforce planning tactics managers are likely to use. Workforce planning is a continual process used to align the needs and priorities of the organization with those of its workforce to ensure it can meet its objectives. Some companies focus on low costs as the key source of their competitiveness. Others attempt to differentiate themselves with their competitors in terms of quality, types of products, and or services they offer. In other words, they try to offer products, services, or features in which customers are willing to pay a premium. Different business strategies such as these will affect how quickly firms must cope with labor shortages or surpluses. Companies focused on keeping their costs low will view a labor surplus as particularly problematic. These companies are likely to reduce a surplus by using tactics that can be carried out quickly, such as layoffs. In contrast, firms that pursue a differentiation strategy might have a bit more cushion to absorb the cost of a labor surplus. These firms are likely to be more willing to rely on labor reduction tactics such as early retirements and attrition, tactics that are slower but less stressful for employees. A firm's strategy affects which of its employees are most critical to its success. Firms focused on differentiation strategies such as product leadership and innovation, customer service, and so on are likely to be particularly dependent on their sales and customer relations staff. In contrast, cost leadership firms are likely to depend on employees with efficiency-related competencies such as operation management skills. This factor, in turn, affects the workforce planning tactics managers of different firms are likely to use. The greater potential strategic impact certain positions have in a firm, the more reluctant a company will be to outsource, offshore, or turn to contingent workers to fill them. Instead, the firm will tend to hire and retain permanent employees for these positions to keep them staffed. In particular, a company's size and stage of development will affect the relative impact of labor shortages and surpluses, as well as who will carry out the company's workforce planning activities. In particularly small companies, the relative impact of labor shortages or surpluses is likely to be greater than in larger organizations. Your responsibility for carrying out workforce planning activities will vary depending on the size and stage of development of your company. Larger companies are likely to have greater resources, support staff, and perhaps a formal HR department to devote to these activities. Companies such as these are also likely to be in a better position to invest in technology that helps them track labor force trends and labor supply throughout their organization. In smaller companies, however, workforce planning activities often fall directly on the managers responsible for supervising the employees who need to be hired. As a manager in a firm such as this, you will have to keep track of the movement of people throughout your unit, the availability of replacement employees to fill open positions, and the viability of using outsourcing or contingent labor if it's needed. A company's corporate culture affects the different tactics firms use to deal with labor shortages and surpluses, as well as how their employees will react to those tactics. These various tactics for dealing with labor shortages or surpluses vary in terms of how fast they'll address the problem, as well as the degree of stress and overload that employees feel during the process. Some companies have cultural values that prevent them from fully pursuing a particular course of action. Any discrepancy between the corporate culture of a firm and the workforce planning tactics its managers use is likely to result in a negative reaction by the company's employees. If the choice you make is inconsistent with the company's cultural values, your choice may lead to lower employee morale and commitment. The Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification or WARN Act, passed in 1989, mandates the amount of notice workers, their families, and their communities must receive prior to a mass layoff. The act covers the following companies: organizations with 100 or more employees, not counting part-time employees, and companies with 100 or more employees, including part-time employees who in the aggregate work at least 4,000 hours per work week. A company that meets these qualifications is required to provide 60 calendar days notice in advance of a plant closing or mass layoff. According to the Act, a plant closing is a situation in which a single employment site or one or more facilities or units within a site will be shut down, with the loss of employment for 50 or more employees during a 30-day period. A mass layoff, in contrast, does not result from a plant closing, but is an employment loss during a 30-day period of 500 or more employees, or 50 to 499 employees if those targeted for the layoff make up at least 1/3 of the workforce. The intent of this act is to provide workers and their families with a transition period to adjust to an impending layoff. An independent contractor is an external worker who performs work for an organization but maintains substantial control over the means and methods of their services. Behavioral control focuses on the extent to which there is a right by the company to direct or control how the individual performs the work. Financial control considers the extent to which the individual has control over the business side of the work and the degree of investment the person makes in the work. The relationship of the parties examines how the company and the individual perceive their work relationship and considers two factors: the presence or absence of employee benefits and the terminology of any existing written contract. In general, the key distinction between an employee and an independent contractor revolves around the issue of control. If you can control the details of what and how an individual performs services for you, the individual is most likely an employee. In contrast, independent contractors typically maintain control over the means and methods of their services. You may control the result of their work, but not the details regarding how that work is completed. The notion of control spans many aspects of employment. To help people understand whether an individual is an employee, the Internal Revenue Service has issued Publication 1779. If you'd like personal help in determining the status of your worker, you can also file Form SS-8. As a manager, you are responsible for withholding income taxes, withholding and paying Social Security and Medicare taxes, and paying unemployment taxes on the wages paid to your employees. You are not responsible for withholding or paying taxes for independent contractors. Beyond these costs, managers are not likely to provide independent contractors with other employment benefits, such as retirement benefits, access to incentive systems and stock option plans, or medical insurance. Given these cost savings, the appeal of hiring independent contractors is understandable. However, an important caveat is worth noting: misclassifying employees as independent contractors is not without costs. Some of the potential costs a firm can be forced to pay for misclassifying employees are back payroll taxes, overtime pay, retirement or other employment benefits such as incentive pay, and medical coverage for injuries an employee incurred during a contractual arrangement.